Welcome to Planet Poetry. I'm Peter Kenny.
And I'm Robin Houghton. And today we're going to be talking about selfhood and sovereignty. We interview Rishi Dastidar and talk about his most recent work, Saffron Jack. But first, some news. This episode is the last in the series.
Yeah, our first series is done, 17 episodes. And we've been trying to find some kind of logic of why it should be 17. And then, of course, it's a haiku, 17 syllables, our series finale.
That's right. So we're going to take a well-earned, we think, summer break. Yeah. But don't worry, we're going to be back with, you guessed it, Series 2 in September. But we'll talk about that a bit more later. First of all, let's hear Peter's chat with Rishi Dastidar.
Rishi Dastidar's poetry has been published by the Financial Times, New Scientist, and the BBC, among others. His reviews have appeared in The Guardian. His debut poetry collection, Ticker Tape, was published by Nine Arches Press in 2017. He is a consulting editor of the Rialto magazine, a member of Malika's Poetry Kitchen. He also chairs the London Writer Development Organisation, Spread the Word, and is editor of The Craft, a guide to making poetry happen in the 21st century. And today we're going to talk about his magnificent long poem, Saffron Jack, published by Nine Arches in 2020. Hi, Rishi. Lovely to have you on our podcast.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that. Listening back to all that stuff, it did make me think, God, when do I sleep?
Well, my first question to you was, did I miss anything out?
I think the only thing I'm contractually obliged to mention at the moment is an anthology I've co-edited, which celebrates 20 years of Malika's Kitchen, as it's our anniversary coming up. And so that book is coming out in August with Corsair. We've told the history of the collective for the first time. Writers of colour, poets of colour in the UK have started to move much more into the mainstream. And basically, if you sent the proverbial Martian down to look at British poetry in 2000 and look at British poetry today, you'd see that it's massively, massively different. And a good percentage of the reason why that is different is exactly down to Malika's Kitchen.
Well, you sold me on that one. So anyway, today we're going to talk about Saffron Jack. Now, focus, Rishi.
Yes.
I found the book contains so many elements. It's very difficult to sum up, but it's got humour, satire. I found it also extremely philosophical, and it plays with the idea of personal sovereignty, rulership, creating your own country. It's just a really inspired way of framing a personal response to the consequences of colonialism. It's just brilliant. But how did the idea for Saffron Jack first start germinating in your mind?
Thank you for the kind words. It's been a long process, and I've had Jack in various different forms rattling around in my head, probably for about 10 years or so. He started life mostly as a dramatic monologue. And I was particularly taken by a blog post by American architecture critic and urbanist called Jeff Manau about a place in Belgium and Netherlands called Baal-Hertog, where basically it is effectively a series of micro-cantons where bits of Belgium are in Netherlands and bits of Netherlands are in Belgium, to the ludicrous point where some houses have some parts of their, one bedroom in Belgium, one bedroom in the Netherlands.
Bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah. I effectively wrote this first dramatic monologue of sort of about 45, 50 pages or so. And over this sort of, then the next sort of 4 or 5 years, I just sort of kept pecking at it. Yeah, there was clearly some sort of blockage between the voice actually fully coming out and expressing itself and the form in which it could do that. And it was only when, in that edition of Poetry magazine from sort of 2016 or whatever it was, that read the Monica de la Torre poem, How to Look at Mexican Highways, that it was, again, that sort of Damascene flash of just going, okay, What if I do that with Jack?
I think the form is... I'm not somebody that tends to fixate on form. In fact, my partner in crime, Robin, is much more of a form hunter than I am. But the form is absolutely perfect for it. I studied philosophy 1,000 years ago, and there was Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which is... and your poem is sort of laid out in numbers and kind of... So it's 1 and then 1.1 or 1.1.1 and so on. But what it does is it kind of gives it a distancing element.
Yes.
And it suggests that what's coming, which is quite bizarre and kind of overinflated and everything, is somehow entirely logical at the same time.
That is exactly right. And that, in retrospect, as it turns out, was the thing that was necessary. Because it apes a legal document or a scientific document, it suddenly gives the wildest fantasies and imaginings something closer to reality. And it suddenly gives credence and a grounding and a sensibility to wild flights of fantasies.
It's a characteristic of humour. I think of, say, a story by Gogol called The Nose, where the character wakes up in the morning without a nose, and the rest of the story proceeds entirely logically from that point until he opens a bread roll the next morning and finds his nose again. But so much humour kind of, there's one mad premise and then proceeds logically. And in a way, waking up in the morning and deciding to declare yourself king is a mad premise. But, because you follow it logically and argue it out so well, it opens the door to humour and all kinds of insights, I think.
Yeah, one of the things I was very concerned about was to use tone to guide you through. And use tone to actually say this isn't as weird as you might think it is. And just almost plant the seed in your mind as to why don't more of us actually question a little bit some of these inheritances and some of these things we take for granted, like contours of nations, like our relative positions in social standings, like our participation in systems of governance.
That's the very thing that really excited me about it.
When you go back and revisit Thomas Paine and you look at what he said in terms of striving for equality and actually pulling down systems so that we are all equal, and there's just a very childish bit of me that just goes, well, why don't we try and do that more? None of these things just are incontrovertible. When you start to say that government is a human invention, the state is a human invention, royal families are a human invention, it's sort of incumbent upon us to think about them harder and question them more and then think, are there better ways of doing things?
Well, yeah, I think your argument exists so vividly in this poem. Can I ask you to read from the beginning?
1. You polish it every night. 1.1. No, not that. 1.2, the crown. 1.2.1, every night. 2, it's the only way. 2.1, a bit of spits and whatever is to hand. Sometimes just your hand. 2.1.1, what you are wearing. 2.2, it seems to do the trick. 3, even at the end, you must maintain appearances, the trappings of office. 3.1. Otherwise, what do you have left? 3.2. Yes, it is only symbolic. 3.2.1. Yes, you are only symbolic. 3.3. But it is what is left, what you have left. 3.4. And they're not taking that away. Not now. 3.5. Not yet. 4. You didn't think it would end like this. 4.1. But then no one ever does. 4.1.1. Divine rights and inviolate. 4.2. You get used to being told the position you hold is immortal. 5. By sleight of mind, you come to believe the same. 5.1. That you are immortal. 5.2. Because position and person are one and the same. 5.2.1. As vested in you, represented by you. 6. So they cannot ever touch you, no matter the screw-ups you make. 6.1, because they are not mistakes. 6.2, they are whimsical unpredictabilities with a happy effect, keeping consort and court, mistresses and subjects on their toes. 6.3, it is not that you are never wrong. Who possesses the temerity or sheer bad manners to whisper that to you? 6.3.1, to your face. 6.4, no matter the pattern of choices, some sort of internal coherency can always be found. 6.5, a chain of logic that is clear and followable. 6.5.1, even if followable isn't a word. 6.6, even if it is irrational to the outside eye. 6.7, even if it is irrational. 6.8, because what does the outside eye know? 6.9, blinded by the gilded edges of the caravan. 6.10, always confusing the trappings for substance. 7, not that the trappings are not substantial. 7.1, or not necessary. 7.1.1, they are a feint, a distraction. 7.1.2, be dazzled enough by the shiny, you won't ask why everything is only being held by a few pieces of tape and string. 7.2, though someone comes along one day and says, 7.2.1, look, I can see some rust. 8. And then it is all over. 9. Not immediately. 10. You keep the motions of pretense up. 10.1. Blinding the rust spotters, the string cutters, the tape slicers. 10.2. Silencing those who say the rust spotters, the string cutters, the tape slicers should have their say and keep saying it. 10.3. Imprisoning those who say that the advice is not bad and should be listened to. 10.4. Sending into exile those who suggest you need new advisors. 10.4.1. Advisors who should look like, sound like the people suggesting you need new advisors. 11. Dismissing and diminishing until the only evidence you are actually who you say you are is a piece of tarnished metal. 12. And your unshakable belief in the purity of your bloodline. 12.1. However diluted it might be.
That 12.1 line, however diluted it may be, is the real kicker, isn't it? Already this is kind of implying that you have subjects, you're imagining all the stuff that your subjects are getting up to. I just find that really funny and really... But also it's just such a construct of the imagination. And yet quite quickly, you have people spotting rust on your statues and making it real and concrete.
Yeah, and I think the making it real and concrete is important, of course, because this is where power and governance and myth sort of interact.
You were talking earlier about the state.
Baal Hertog.
And how that sort of, those territories were conflicted or blurred or uncertain and going through actual houses. Can you read to us the section from 36 to 45, which is contains the idea of otherizing actual neighbours?
Just how nations by definition have to start making others to actually exist as nations. 36. So, before the fighting started, 36.1, entirely predictably, by the way. 36.1.1, two overproud and underclever populations rubbing each other up the wrong way for 3/4 of a millennium. 36.2, this little old hamlet where I'm now reigning had been a governmental nightmare. 36.2.1, a continental oddity. 36.2.1.1, an administrative anomaly. 36.2.1.2, a legalistic fuck-up. 37, it's hard to see why. It's hard to see much here. 37.1, some squares that mean something to someone. 37.1.1, a few coloured lines making a collection of villages. 37.2, or maybe a power play. 37.3, an aborted archipelago that forgot where the sea was. 37.4. The dangers of irrational geography. 38. What do you see here? 38.1. The future history of humanity. 38.2. One endless individual bun fight. 39. It was. A town where two countries intertwined. 39.1. Not met, but mixed. 39.2. One house was in one country. 39.2.1. The neighbours in another. 39.3. No joke. 39.4. One door, Crazyland. 39.4.1. Next door, Barmylandia. 39.4.1.1. Not that I can call them that anymore. 39.4.1.2. Because somebody will shoot me. 39.4.1.3. For being an insult of a neighbour. 39.4.2. And yes, in some of the houses, a border right through the bathroom too. 40. 3,000 people living as two. 41. Well, they were. 41.1, with double of everything. 41.2, many secretaries of foreign tongues. 41.3, two traditions, both heartfelt, both ridiculous. 41.4, two churches, two schools. 41.5, two town halls for parading past. 41.6, two sets of lights, road signs, post boxes. 41.7, electrics, telephone systems, even double drains. 41.7.1, twin natural monopoly fun. 41.8, two lots of media because a uniform babble wasn't enough. 42, each side its own newspaper too. 42.1, each used to be content to stir the pot. 42.1.1, to keep things a little spicy, entertaining. 42.2.2, but that was before prevailing economic imperatives meant things had to get hotter. 42.3, war sells papers, they thought. 42.3.1, that they weren't wrong about. Pity it wasn't a long-term redoubt. 43, like they've been planning for it. Two sets of policemen became two armies. 43.1, small armies, sure. 43.2, but when you've got a grenade without a pin at your feet, who's counting the infantry wandering past? 44, everyone pasted their particular allegiance on their front door. 44.1, the good citizens, the loyal citizens, patriotic citizens. 44.2, so it wasn't hard for the opposing team to find them. 44.2.1, deal with them. 45, a gap in the crack of history.
That's a lovely encapsulation of such a bizarre historical anomaly. It feels so right for this book. We ought to have the moment of the self-crowning, which is maybe many of us have fantasized about, but...
Yeah, 65. And you remembered that on the train. 65.1, that feeling of fucking coolness. 65.2, and you remembered you'd wanted some of that then. 65.2.1, and then it hit you with the force of what would be a biblical revelation. 65.2.1.1, if you believed in biblical revelations. 65.2.2, that you still did, you really did, and that you shouldn't have let yourself slip away from that dream. 65.2.2.1, or was it that you didn't work hard enough and do what you needed to do to make sure you got there? 65.3. But this time, this now, it wasn't hazy at all. 65.4. And what was clearer than anything else was the notion that you had been right. 65.5. That you should have tried to get some of that action, and now was the time to change that. 65.5.1. And get into the monarchy racket. 66. You decided you would become a king. 67. Now what? 68. It's one thing to think it, 68.1, to say it to yourself, 68.2, then maybe a whisper, 68.2.1 under your breath, 68.3, then quietly, 68.4, then louder, 68.5, then louder, 68.6, then louder still, 68.7, then louder again, 68.8, louder and louder and louder, 68.9, until it echoes down the carriage, 68.10, until it ricochets out into the sea, 69, I will be a king.
I've done a lot of commuting in the past and sort of having these sort of grandiose visions while chugging along on a train. And I can imagine in my stranger moments having something like that too.
As grandiose as it's framed there, it is actually a natural reaction, especially in a situation like a commute. You are in a situation of relative disempowerment.
So far, perhaps we've been giving the impression that the book is primarily psychological, but it definitely takes on more the social anxieties and difficulties faced by people of colour in the United Kingdom, being questioned just for being alive in the country that you happen to be born in.
164. So when a country, which in its own imagination, 164.1, is one of the most tolerant places on the planet, 164.2, turns out to be less tolerant than its imaginings, 164.3. Where do you go? 164.4. If you cannot hide in a city, a metropolis, which has evolved to absorb every creed and colour, 164.4.1. Where do you go?
Yeah.
That line in particular about it being more tolerant, that's certainly something that I was taught growing up and something that evidentially certainly felt true. But one thing we were certainly taught was that post-1945, Britain was a lot better at decolonising than the other imperial powers. Yeah, the specific example that sticks in the head is Britain didn't have a war in Algeria like the French did. And of course, when you say it like that, that's absolute crap. Brush partition under a carpet. We brush Kenya under a carpet. But this was the sort of comforting myth. And at one level, you have to sort of believe it, because where else are you going to go, right? But also, more fundamentally than that, why should I go anywhere else? I'm fucking born it, mate.
Your Suffering Jack character seems to detest curries.
So that is actually a nuance that's worth unpacking. The fact that even just expressing that suddenly fries people's expectations of, oh, you're now suddenly not who I thought you were. Right, okay. But who did you think I was? Because again, I am British. Do you go round expecting other British people to fit an aspect that just my skin colour presents? The fact that Britain has effectively evolved into a multi-ethnic state without really even sort of thinking about it is both its genius and its curse. Precisely because notions of British and Britishness are so baggy, it can absorb everything and anything and project it back outwards. But as it turns out, the moment that you put any stress on that, it actually turns out that there's not necessarily as much there that's holding stuff together. One way of reading the book, absolutely, is a pessimism about the extent to which Britain can maintain itself as a nation over the next 20, 50 years, and then what the hell happens at that point.
The future is fragmentary.
You can talk about these things in these ways through this sort of semi-abstracted vehicle of a poem that you can't necessarily do, again, through essay and prose, because it immediately gets bogged down in policy, it immediately gets bogged down in solutions. And part of the reason for this book is just wanting to lob some rocks. If we accept that since the 1980s, or actually since the 1960s, that prevailing trend of greater individuality and greater individualism has been prevalent, what is the actual ultimate expression of that? It's actually to go away from any sense of feeling of belonging to a nation and actually say, oh, fuck it, for whatever reasons, I'm superior, I'm different, whatever, I should be master of mistress of my own nation.
Could I ask you to read the 91 to 93, which I think it sort of deals with individuality as a means of control?
91. Of course, they, The people with any form of power don't follow their own logic. 91.1, separate people out, make them atomized. 91.1.1, keep telling everyone that they're unique. 91.1.1.1, an individual. 91.1.2, that they matter, truly matter, more than nearly anyone else. 91.1.2.1, except a few blood ties and maybe the other name on a marriage certificate. And that is it. 92. Now, why would you then be surprised if some of the 92.1, how shall you say, 92.1.1, more impressionable amongst you, 92.2, might believe it, 92.2.1, start to embroider it, 92.2.2, start to make that tale, that narrative, 92.2.3, a little more dramatic, 92.2.3.1, and take it to the obvious conclusion, 93, that every man, every woman should be their own island. 93.1. Yes, John Donne, you heard.
I just think that's such a fascinating section because there has been this sort of relentless focus on, atomizing everybody, as you put it. There's no such thing as society anymore.
To complete the quote, what she said, there's no such thing as society. There is only individuals and their families.
Yeah.
You braid that together, that trend towards sovereignty. Yeah, and you think about the way that a lot of the last 10 years has been framed around ideas of sovereignty. But what's never actually stated is, why would we be concerned about sovereignty anyway if it wasn't actually coming up from a sense that we need to be much more individually sovereign as well? Are we really then that surprised that sort of coalesces into a meta-narrative that the national unit that you happen to be in at the moment also must be sovereign? When, of course, the glaring irony being of a lot of the challenges that we face are things that can only be solved collectively. Would Jack be as angry a book if Brexit hadn't happened? No. No. And I think, hopefully, at one level, Jack is an intervention. We're starting to look at people's souls, because what makes someone feel British? What makes someone feel French? All these sorts of things.
Very hard to pin down.
Yeah, precisely. And we have, to a large extent, been playing with stuff that is very flammable. 141. You cannot walk into an airport without breaking into a sweat. 141.1, which is, so you have been told, one of the signs, 141.1.1, of a terrorist. 141.2, the steps taken to protect everyone, 141.2.1, including you, 141.2.2, end up compromising you. 141.3, so much for sophisticated profiling. 141.3.1, does it take into account 141.3.1.1, your lack of facial hair? 141.3.1.2, the puckerness of your education. 141.3.1.3, your glottal stop. 141.3.1.4, your unasked for nationality. 141.4, apparently not. 141.5, which you will let go the first time. 141.5.1 the second time, 141.5.2 the third time, 141.6, but the 10th, 141.7. Then your profiling system is 141.7.1 willful, 141.7.2 bullying, 141.7.3 fucked. 142. You put it this way. 142.1. You are walking down the street, 142.1.1, and you hear someone call you Packy. 142.1.2. Don't gasp. It happens. It still happens. 142.1.2.1. Even in places where you think it does not, could not. 142.1.3. You let it go. 142.1.4. After all, you cannot be sure. 142.1.4.1. You are on your own. 142.1.4.2. You do not want the hassle. 142.1.4.3. The trouble. 142.2. Sometime later, a few days. 142.2.1. A few weeks, a few months. 142.2.2. It happens again. 142.2.3. You walk on again. 142.3, Then it happens again. 142.3.1, and again. 142.3.1.1, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. 142.4, and then it happens again. 143, and that 10th time you turn round. 143.1, you see who did it. 143.1.1, you go up to them, run up to them. 143.1.2, blood rushing round your system like a train. 143.1.3, and you put your face this close to theirs. 143.1.3.1, and you scream until you hit them. 143.1.3.1.1, or they hit you.
Yeah, I like the way that the idea of going to an airport and that sort of triggering all this kind of chain of kind of microaggressions and people saying things in the street, and to actually getting to that point of violence.
Yeah, and microaggressions is exactly the right term for it. I think trusting to that rule that most people of colour will know when something, an action, a behaviour, an interaction is racist in intent, whether thinkingly or unthinkingly. There is a level of day-to-day living which is, if you think of it as it's a fine grain of additional bumps that mean that you can't live your life necessarily as smoothly as another person.
Mm.
And most of that is not racism. Most of that is not an outward expression of prejudice or hate. But what it is a subconscious and unconscious expression of you not quite belonging because you don't fit a template that we've been grown up with of what a person of this nationality looks like. And so when people say things like, representation's tokenistic, or, it should only be up to a certain percentage minority or whatever, the usefulness of and efficacy of that is actually twofold. One is just that sheer simple, you see it in the newspaper, you actually, as a person from that minority background, you start to think, oh, that's maybe possible for me to become. But the wider point is to reinforce and re-educate everyone in the country. This is actually what a citizen looks like as well.
Mm.
People will listen to that and go, this is all just sort of basically paranoid bollocks, because of course British citizenship has embraced that for years. To which, of course, the devastating response is Windrush, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
There is absolutely no way that you can credibly say now that the British state thought in a colourblind way when it came to citizenship, because it fundamentally did not recognise the truth that the people who arrived in 1947 were citizens. And so suddenly you're into this morass of where citizens have to prove themselves to be citizens through dint of paper.
After decades, it's obscene, isn't it?
And so that is the sort of stuff that has been uncorked, and that is some of the stuff that I want to illuminate.
So, Rishi, to tie up, I'd like you to read the bit from the book, which is actually a bit like a stage direction, which is another thing that works its way into this unusual form. And it's where you're actually unfurling your own flag. Can you read that for us?
Yeah, that's right. And I should set this up by saying that just because of Jack's roots as a dramatic monologue, I very deliberately left in some pieces of text through the poem that feel like stage directions. So, another object now unfurls from the ceiling, obscuring the map. It is a giant Union Jack, except that it is saffron and gold and red and brown and green in hue, vibrant and alive. There is an almost childish glee on his face as it unrolls. 137. Well, why not? It is mine as much as it is yours. 137.1. You just thought it could be 137.1.2, spiced up a little. 137.2. It just needed a remix.
That's fab. I think that's a flag I'd love to see fluttering one day.
One of the campaigns that I worked on, ad campaigns I worked on a long time ago, was for a thing called Team Green Britain. You don't think anything of taking the flag and turning it shades of green to say, look, this is a thing that we have to do.
Yeah.
I don't see why we can't necessarily do that with the Union Jack to reflect more of the fact that the truth of Britain is we are a variety of pasts and communities and different roots and nations now. And let's bring some of that, more of that to the fore.
Well, on that bombshell, Rishi, I think we'll tie up now. Thanks so much for coming onto our podcast.
Not at all, Peter. Thank you so much for the time. And I've loved chatting about it.
That was interesting because I would have said at one point you said, there was quite a lot of humour in this book. And I have to say I haven't read it, but on that interview and on the basis of Rishi's readings and what you talked about, it's biting satire, isn't it? I mean, it's in the real kind of spirit of Jonathan Swift. It's not funny in that sense. For me, I found it quite biting, and I'm sure that's kind of the idea. That means I got it, hopefully. But I was certainly intrigued at this idea of the form of it, the numbering, particularly because that's so different, isn't it? And to begin with, I was thinking, I'm having to really focus on the words because the numbers are kind of getting in the way. But then I got into the rhythm of it and the way that it kind of builds momentum, and the way Rishi read, he got more and more impassioned as these numbers.
Relentless.
Yeah, relentless. Yeah. And the numbers got longer, and then it became quite difficult for him even to say the numbers, didn't it? When it got to sort of 141.3.1.2. So it did have a momentum of its own, and it did contribute to the form in a very interesting way.
I think, it does do that. I think sitting down to read the book, I did actually laugh out loud a couple of times.
Did you? Yeah, because I didn't get the whole book, I suppose, the benefit of that. So maybe that would have...
But I think it's also about your sense of humour, because I think there is that kind of absurd sense of humour, where you start with a crazy premise and then work on quite relentlessly and logically from that. And I find that snowballing makes me start to laugh, maybe because it's quite a tense thing, but...
Yeah.
But there are moments there's some, good little one-liners in there. I wasn't sure how he was going to read it out, whether he was going to read all the numbers or not.
Yeah.
Its form is exactly like this Wittgenstein philosophy book with all these numbers. And in Rishi's book and in the Wittgenstein, what you do is you just dimly aware of the numbers ticking past, but you actually focus on the stuff that's written.
Yes.
And I think it was fascinating to hear and read it because of those reasons of, the relentlessness and the kind of overwhelmedness by the, pseudo-logical weight of all these numbers. So I was interested by the fact that he chose to read the numbers.
I can see why he did, because it contributed to communicating the point, and it kind of both speeded him up and slowed him down at the same time. And that in itself was interesting. And it's not really like a legal document or a treatise in that we're not talking even complete sentences per number, are we? Sometimes it's just a word or two. So it is completely contrived in that sense, but I understand that it's supposed to give the kind of the impression of it being a weighty, logical, rational treatise, I guess.
Yeah. Well, he was using the word grandiose about it. And there is, there's a humour in that sort of pomposity of this character, but in that absurdity, it kind of illuminates all kinds of things about the absurdity that's inherent in nations and kings themselves, and this idea of having authority over other people for historical and bogus reasons.
Yes. I thought that
afterwards, actually that the metaphor of like a saffron jack in these different colours, but the way a Union Jack's got all these kind of lines crossing over, all these crosses and and I think what I really admired about it was the simplicity of this idea of declaring yourself king is something you could write on the back of a fag packet, but there was so much kind of intersecting from that one idea. I was very impressed by it and the sort of intellectual audacity of it.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it, the intellectual audacity. And it's, if Rishi were simply to write all the things he felt about this, as he started to explain at the end of the interview, then
it'd be a very heavy read.
It would be a diatribe, wouldn't it? But he's created this very elegant vehicle for what he wants to get across, which I thought was very, very clever.
Yeah.
Of course, Rishi was one of our first guest readers at our Telltale events, wasn't he?
We're up in the Poetry Cafe, I think we were.
Yeah, in the Poetry Cafe. It probably
first time I heard Rishi read, actually.
It was like 2016 or something like that, I think.
Just launched his first collection that year, I think.
Was it his first collection? Yeah. So
once you've encountered us, we never let you go.
We never let you go. So here we are, the last episode of Series 1. We need a party.
Been a long term, actually.
It has, but we've both learnt a lot, haven't we? What do you think you've taken away from it?
Oh, God, all kinds of things, really. Well, first of all, it's turned me back into being a fan of reading poetry.
Yeah.
6 months has been a real plus in my life, and I've read lots of writers. And it's thanks to you bringing in writers that widened my reading. And that's been absolutely brilliant.
I think that's a mutual thing, isn't it? Because similarly, you've mentioned names and you've pointed me to people that I didn't know their work. And having the podcast has been a great reason or excuse, if you like, to approach poets and get them on. And then you learn more about their work, and it is fascinating. So it's definitely opened up a new depth of poetry to me too.
I'm in the business of trying to get a first full collection together, just assembled. I haven't got a publisher for it or anything, but I've learned loads of things. And from the practical stuff of the people we talked to, about how they've done it, I found it quite heartening that, say, Charlotte Gann was writing 2 collections side by side, or how Claire Shaw that you spoke to, was talking, that big metaphor of the flood kind of held her whole collection together. Or thinking about John McCulloch, how it took him like 10 years to write Spacecraft, and then the next book, he wrote it in pretty much a year.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Wasn't it like sort of open the floodgates or something? But I was particularly interested in just how long people take between collections. And Jack Underwood, I think it had been a while since his previous, a bit of a gap between collections, and certainly Ian Ellams it was amazing the way he talked about putting that collection together, his first collection, and he'd appeared in so many other vehicles, and he is one of these polymath playwrights, designer, everything extraordinaire. And his first collection, I remember him saying that he wanted to wait, not rush, but wait until he had something that was really worthy of being collected. And if there's one thing I've remembered through the whole series, it's that, is it worthy of being collected? And I have that in my mind, because like you, I'm still struggling for this elusive first collection. Is it worthy? I always got that in my head.
The fact that, so many writers had different approaches to the way they did it shows there's no kind of one right way of doing it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of reassuring.
Yeah.
And having sort of personal prejudices confirmed, like Catherine Maris, when you spoke to her and she was talking about using found and fictional elements in her work. I really enjoyed that idea of being able to be more fictional, but just the poet's sheer generosity and just sharing all that time and all their thinking with us.
Yeah, that really has been brilliant, hasn't it?
When we spoke to Pascal Petit, she was our first episode.
Yeah.
And I just think, actually, she was so generous because, we hadn't even launched by then. So,
she didn't know what she's getting into.
Yeah, that was really kind of her, to have somebody of Pascal's kind of standing in the poetry world to kick us off was absolutely fantastic. While we've been doing this, what's the wizard behind the curtain been doing?
Oh, God.
You've been studying a bit, haven't you?
Yes,
I've been reading loads of Dante and stuff.
Yes, I've made lots of references to the studying and the Dante. I've come to the end of my first year on a part-time MA in poetry and poetics at York University, and it's not a creative writing degree at all. There's no creative writing involved. I thought it would be easier than it has been. What does that say about me? But it is 20 years since I was in the academic scene, and I did find it a bit overwhelming, the weight of literary theory and the vocabulary that's required. I thought I had all that, things have changed, I think. And
Yeah.
clearly I'm older and I've got a lot fewer brain cells now than I had 20 years ago or even 40 years ago. But that's been fantastic and very stimulating to my writing. And in fact, the elusive first collection that I'm working on now is really quite heavily inspired by Dante's comedy. So I'm dipping in and out of the comedy all the time now. The tutor at the end of the course said, don't stop reading and don't stop reading Dante. And I see why he said that. There's no reason to, because there's always something that you've missed, always something that you've missed. And you think, oh, God, that's good.
Yeah. So have you been sending things out for publication at all? Or?
Well, not so much. It's been a bit of it's really weird. Last year I decided not to enter any single poem competitions because I just thought it's expensive and it's a bit ridiculous. And I'm easily distracted if I see a theme or something. Oh yeah, I could write something for that. And in fact, quite recently I did one of these Arvon at home courses. The tutors were Carrie Etta and Sasha Dugdale. It was fantastic. And it was geared towards putting together a collection. And one thing that Carrie said particularly, I remember, was that she finds works for her if she's thinking about a book, she writes poems with that book in mind. She doesn't write poems to send specifically to magazines or on themes or to competitions. Everything she writes is geared towards that book. And I just thought that's quite a good idea for me to not be thinking, oh, Ambit closes in a week, maybe I'll shoot something off there. No, and I'm not putting pen to paper unless I'm thinking, okay, what am I focused on? I'm going to write around this book. Is this going to be worthy of going into my collection? And if not, I'm just going to put it to one side, so I'm trying not to be distracted by sending. I have sent a few things off. I've got a poem coming up in Lighthouse magazine, and there's a launch that I'm reading at next Friday, the 23rd. Oh, cool. So yeah, and had a poem in Butcher's Dog, which is nice, really nice, lovely magazine, very excellent. Jo Clements, who runs that mag, she's excellent at doing that. I do one or two other things. I'm on the group of people that do short reviews for the Frogmore Papers. So I've got a pamphlet by Sharon Black to review this month. She's a poet I have a lot of time for. So how about you, Peter? What? Because you are one of these people that, you're a talented writer in all kinds of genres. So what have you been up to in between heavy work? I should say, I have a lot more time on my hands than Peter. He's often working full on for weeks at a time. But we still managed to get the podcast together. So what have you been up to, Peter?
Poetry was my first love, but it's been a bit tempestuous. There have been times when I've been getting lots of publications and times when, poetry is just, nobody wants to touch what I do with a barge pole. I've turned over the years to other things like writing short stories and plays. And obviously I was hoping to get a play out last year. And of course, events took against that. But I've been starting the last few years writing short stories, kind of psychological horror-ish, but not kind of vampire-y or slasher-y or anything like that, just sort of unsettling type stories. I'm getting a few of those published in little magazines online and in a magazine called Supernatural Tales. But yeah, no, I started writing poetry a lot again this year after not much for quite a while. And I'm delighted to find that, I've got a poem coming out in Finished Creatures, which is edited by Jan Heritage, and another one in 14 magazine.
17 magazine, that was some teen magazine, I think, wasn't it? 70s.
14 magazine, edited by Richard Skinner, which is, he accepted one of my new poems. But yeah, it's what you were saying about writing poems for the particular collection. I find I'm really focusedly writing now a series of poems that are all around the same theme. I've got half of the book done already, and I've got another 24 poems I want to have to complete the other half. I'm polishing, a dozen poems at a time. None of them are ready to send out, even though, I'm quite excited by some of the things I'm doing. So
yeah.
doing this podcast has just enthused me about poetry again and kind of reminded me of why I love it so much and why it's so worth thinking about. I'd really like talking to, people from different cultures as well, like, Lian Hao or Yang Lian.
Yes, we've had a good international sort of spread, and we plan to do more of that, don't we?
Yeah, it's nice not to be parochial and just kind of remember there's poets like us scribing away all around the world.
Indeed, yes, indeed.
Have you got a holiday? Are you going to get away at all this summer? With all this time we've suddenly got?
Well, we are planning to go to Norfolk in September for a week.
All right.
August, we're having a couple of days in London. Our little choir, the Lewis Singers, singing Evensong at Westminster Abbey. So that'll be a lovely jaunt.
That's a big part of your life, really, isn't it?
A huge part, yeah. And my husband too. Well, more so for him. That's his living. So we've got that to look forward to. But actually, summer is not a time we tend to go away because summer in Eastbourne, where we live, is gorgeous. So if we get some nice sun.
Mrs. Kenny and I are going off to spend a bit of time just near the Welsh border.
Ah.
Normally, if we go away and usually have a sort of foreign break, I take books of poetry by people from the country I'm going to.
That's a good idea.
Always makes me feel like I've got a bit of an insight into where I'm staying that's different from just kind of being a tourist there. And that's one of the reasons I love Greek poetry so much, is that, I've spent a lot of time just having it large in Greece over the years.
Yeah.
There's something about, getting over your hangover and reading a bit of Cavafy on the beach or something that's quite nice.
That's a great idea. It's a great idea.
So anyway, I've got Mabin Ogion.
Gosh, what's that?
It's a sort of Welsh epic poem.
Gosh.
And it sort of collects lots of old stories and weaves them into a tale. I think it was the 13th century, but I haven't read it, as you can tell by how much I know about it. But I'm going to take it and sort of get into the bones and the legends of the land that I'm driving through, whatever.
Oh, lovely. A great idea. I think we need to finish with a poem, don't we? And this is our 17th episode, as you mentioned, Peter. 17 syllables. Maybe you've got a haiku for us.
Well, I've got one up my sleeve. Sadly, I don't think it has 17 syllables in this translation.
Oh, no.
but it's from Basho, the most famous Japanese poet of all time.
Yeah.
It's very simple. It's from the Penguin Classics, Basho on Love and Barley, the haiku of Basho. And it's the 45th little haiku in the collection. And it goes like this. Draining the sake cask, behold, a gallon flower vase.
I like that. That's a very optimistic note, I think, to end on. We're reusing that gallon-sized cask.
Yeah, you glug down all this booze, and what have you got? A handy container. It's sort of recycling. It's brilliant.
Excellent. I love that.
But are those flowers, are they the result of having drunk sake?
Oh.
Well, these 17 episodes have been a sake flask. Maybe the next one will be a gallon flower vase.
Sounds lovely. I hope so.
It does.
So when are we back?
In September.
23rd.
23rd, yeah. Because we all need a break. You possibly need a break from hearing Robin and I burgling on. But imagine how refreshed your ears will be by the time it's the 23rd of September again. So have a lovely break to all our loyal, and frankly, some of them are disloyal, aren't they? But to all our listeners.
Yes.
However faithful you've been,
That's
dear
right.
listener.
Thank you for listening.
And see you after the summer's done. Bye-bye.
Bye.